Dr. Emily Carter's eyes flickered over the rows of illuminated data on the monitor, her fingers tapping anxiously on the metal edge of her workstation. The room buzzed with a subdued but unmistakable energy, the kind that rippled through labs when science was on the edge of rewriting everything it knew. Today marked the unveiling of the Epsilon Protocol, a project so veiled in secrecy that even its core team only understood fragments of its full intent. Emily knew just enough to be intrigued, but the question gnawed at her. Why were they pushing this technology so hard, so fast? They called it X-0, a scanner designed to pierce the deep void of space, to seek out distant planets with a precision no human eye had yet achieved. The official story was that it was a first step toward discovering new habitable worlds. But Emily felt the weight of an unspoken truth pressing down on her. "All right, team," she said, pulling herself up. Her voice cut through the hum of machines, drawing her colleagues' attention. "This is it. X-0's initialization phase is complete. We're about to see what the universe has hidden from us." Alex Rodriguez, the team's lead engineer, scoffed lightly as he glanced over from his station. Or maybe it's just another barren rock. We've scanned hundreds of these things, Carter. This one won't be any different. But Alex's bravado couldn't mask his own uncertainty. Emily knew he felt it too, that unsettling sense that they were prying too deeply, too recklessly. Her gaze shifted to Sarah Lee, the mathematician whose calculations had made this mission possible. Sarah's normally bright expression was dulled, her hands nervously clutching a thin silver chain at her neck. Sarah caught Emily's gaze and offered a wan smile. "It's just, I keep thinking, what if we find something we weren't meant to?" An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. It was a sentiment no one dared voice openly, yet the thought hung in the air. Emily nodded, feeling a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Dread, perhaps, or a dim recognition of something lurking just outside her understanding. As she pressed the final command to begin the scan, the room's lights dimmed, replaced by the cool, artificial glow of monitors. The air became thick, and an electric hum filled the space, reverberating through every surface. X-0 pulsed, coming alive with data streaming in from unfathomable distances. It was mesmerizing, watching numbers and symbols flash, a testament to the machine's power. Then the display froze, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Is that?" she whispered, unable to finish the thought. The silence deepened, each scientist's attention now locked on the screen, where an image began to coalesce from the data. A planet. Not just any planet, but one with contours and textures eerily familiar. Sarah's voice trembled as she murmured, "It's almost like Earth." It was uncanny. The landmasses bore an eerie resemblance, the atmospheric layers rich and dense, the sprawling oceans stretching out in almost recognizable shapes. For a brief, terrifying moment, Emily felt like she was gazing into a distorted reflection of their own world, a mirror where something essential was horribly, fundamentally wrong. The screen glitched, distorting the image in unnatural pulses. Then the focus sharpened, revealing landscapes that could have belonged to Earth. Mountains that rose in stark majesty, forests stretching endlessly under a crimson sky, and cities. "Yes, cities," Alex whispered, his face drained of color. They hadn't expected to find cities. But as they zoomed in, the structures revealed an unsettling pattern, roads coiling in fractal-like designs, leading to nowhere. Buildings stood in impossible formations, twisted and malformed, as if they were shaped by a mind that only half understood human architecture. Shadows clustered around these structures, dark patches that seemed to ripple and stretch, shapes that might have been people but moved in ways that made Emily's skin crawl. "Is anyone else feeling like we're being watched?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. As if in response, the monitor crackled with static. A flickering distortion overtook the image, and for an instant something seemed to gaze back at them. Emily's heart hammered as she swore she saw eyes, multiple eyes, inhuman and cold, layered within the planet's darkened cities. "This can't be right," Alex muttered, frantically typing commands to analyze the data stream. "It's not possible. There shouldn't be any signals coming from there." But the signals were there, piercing through the silence of space, each wave interwoven with strange rhythmic pulses. Emily leaned forward, transfixed as a faint sound like a low hum seeped through the speakers. She couldn't understand it, yet its tones vibrated in her bones, and the hum rose in a steady, almost familiar cadence. It was a language not meant for human ears, yet somehow striking chords of recognition. The hum twisted into what sounded like words, a voice distorted, yet unmistakably intelligent. Emily's skin prickled as the words grew clearer. "Why are you here?" The team froze, breaths held in horrified anticipation. Alex looked at Emily, his face a portrait of shock and denial. Did we just hear something from that planet?" Emily could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She felt a strange, alien intelligence brush against her mind, like fingers trailing down her spine. This wasn't just a planet. It was something more, an entity, a consciousness that had been awakened by their observation, by their meddling. "It knows," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It knows we're watching." In the span of seconds, what had been thrilling scientific discovery turned to existential terror. They had peered into the depths of space, only to find that something had been waiting, watching, and perhaps hungering. And now that something knew they were here. For the first time in her career, Emily felt truly afraid. The quiet in the lab was broken only by the rhythmic humming of the equipment, but to Dr. Emily Carter and her team, the sound had taken on a sinister quality, as though something were breathing through their devices. She could feel it, a subtle shift in the air, like the heavy silence before a storm. A 59 was no longer just a distant, nameless planet. It was something else, something that seemed to pulse with a dark, malignant awareness. Days after the initial discovery, the team found themselves plagued by strange dreams, each one vivid and chilling, like a parasite feeding off their collective minds. Emily was the first to experience them, visions of twisted landscapes drenched in sickly hues, bizarrely human figures with faces that were hollow, vacant, and almost aware. She awoke each morning drenched in sweat. The image of those shadowy figures burned into her memory, like a warning. When she finally confided in Alex and Sarah, she found that they too had been tormented by the same disturbing visions. Each dream was eerily similar, yet laced with subtle variations, hints of shared knowledge that unsettled Emily to her core. It was as though E59 itself was seeding them with pieces of a truth too immense to comprehend, a truth that was beginning to tear at the edges of their minds. "It's more than just coincidence," Sarah whispered one evening, her fingers tracing the faint dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept in days, and it showed. The dreams, They're coming from E59. I can feel it. It's like it's reaching out to us. But why? What does it want? Alex's voice was tinged with desperation. He had always been the skeptic, the rational one, but now he sounded small, his words edged with a fear he could no longer hide. Emily shook her head, struggling to find an answer. She could feel the question gnawing at her sanity, a gnawing terror that festered with every moment she spent thinking about the planet. I don't know, but I think we've done something irreversible. The lab grew quiet, each of them lost in thoughts too dark to share aloud. But their silence was broken by an odd, subtle shift in the hum of the equipment. The machines flickered, casting shadows across the room as a new transmission from E59 came through, a pulsing, irregular signal that seemed almost intentional. Emily leaned in, transfixed, as a haunting, static-laced rhythm played through the speakers. It wasn't just a signal, it was a language. The alien sounds clawed at her mind, pulling at memories and thoughts she could not explain. Then, in that strange, dark frequency, she heard a faint voice, twisted yet eerily familiar, whispering words that burrowed into her brain. They were us. We are waiting. What did it say? Alex's voice was a strained whisper, his eyes wide with terror. The realization dawned on him slowly, his face paling as he processed the words. Emily wanted to respond, to reassure him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the message was more than a mere transmission. It was a glimpse into something dark, something ancient and twisted beyond comprehension. E59 had reached out, and now it was creeping, subtly, insidiously, into their minds. As the days passed, the nightmares grew darker. The figures in their dreams became more defined, more aware, their vacant expressions twisting into something malignant and vengeful. The team began seeing flashes of E59's cities in their waking hours, buildings rising in impossible shapes against an alien sky, roads coiling in fractal spirals, disappearing into darkened horizons. The figures watched from the windows of these empty cities, their eyes following, tracking each team member with unblinking, predatory focus. The team's physical and mental states deteriorated in tandem. Sarah, once meticulous and optimistic, now seemed a shadow of herself, muttering phrases in languages none of them recognized, her fingers tapping out patterns only she could see. She no longer responded to her name. When Emily confronted her, Sarah would stare blankly, her eyes glazed, as though the person within had slipped away. Then came the whispers. Late one night, Emily heard them, faint voices threading through the equipment, weaving in and out of the ambient static. They were soft, almost soothing, yet laced with a chilling malice that froze her blood. They spoke of things too vast to grasp, truths that seemed to twist reality itself, casting a shadow over everything she thought she knew. She tried to ignore them, but they burrowed into her mind, haunting her thoughts, her every waking moment. One evening, Sarah approached Emily, her eyes glazed and her lips moving in a soft chant. "They are waiting, Emily," she whispered, her voice a rasp that sounded like it had traveled across galaxies. "They know we're here. They want to show us what's beyond." Emily backed away, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Sarah's skin looked pale, almost translucent, as though whatever was left of her had begun to slip away. Sarah reached out, her fingers cold and unfeeling, as they brushed Emily's arm. "They are part of us. They've always been part of us. We were never alone." A terrible, dawning realization washed over Emily. She tried to disconnect herself, to shut out the voices, the images. But the connection was unbreakable, something deeper than technology, older than memory. Somehow, the distance between them and E59 had collapsed, and the planet was reaching across the void, wrapping its influence around their minds like dark tendrils. It was no longer merely a distant entity. It had become an infection, a dark awareness spreading within each of them. Emily stumbled back, clutching her head, desperate to free herself from the horror that clawed at her mind. But as she looked at her team, she saw the hollow, lifeless expressions on their faces. They were no longer fully themselves. They had become conduits, vessels for something far beyond human comprehension. A single chilling thought struck her as she sank into her chair, her gaze fixed on the now blurry images of E59's twisted landscapes on the monitor. It wasn't them waiting for us. We had always been waiting for them. Emily closed her eyes, but the images didn't fade. E59 had awoken, and its gaze was fixed upon them, its dark intelligence seeping into their thoughts, their dreams, their very identities. In that moment, she understood the terrible truth, the terrible cost of knowledge they should never have sought. They had opened a door, and there was no closing it. It was around midnight when Dr. Emily Carter felt the first wave of nausea, a deep, disorienting sickness that washed over her like a fever, twisting her stomach into knots. The lab felt wrong, the air stifling, heavy with a scent she couldn't quite place, something metallic and rotten. She couldn't shake the sense that she was no longer alone, that something cold and watchful had seeped into the room with her. "Emily," a voice whispered from the shadows, fractured and layered, as though several voices spoke in unison. She spun around, but there was no one there, only the flickering monitors casting pale, sickly light across the lab. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, forcing herself to regain control. It was just exhaustion, she told herself. The endless nights of work, the constant hum of the equipment, the relentless data streams from E59, it was all wearing her down. Yet, deep down, she knew it was more than that. Something else had taken root within the team, within the very air they breathed, tainting every thought, every emotion. Alex had barely spoken in days, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. He stayed hunched over his workstation, muttering to himself, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the controls. She knew he was trying to sever the connection to E59, but every attempt ended in failure. No matter how many times they shut down the systems, the feed from E59 would re-establish itself, stronger, more insistent, like a pulse that quickened each time they tried to escape its grasp. One night, in a fit of desperation, Alex had slammed his fists against the console, his voice breaking as he shouted, "It won't stop! It won't let us go! Don't you get it, Emily? We're trapped!" His words lingered in the air, an echo of despair that seemed to resonate through the room, as if the walls themselves were listening, absorbing their hopelessness. Emily watched him now, hunched over, his shoulders sagging with defeat. She wanted to reach out to offer some comfort, but she could feel her own mind slipping, her thoughts unraveling. If 59's images filled her mind, even when she closed her eyes. She saw the planet's twisted cities, its empty, faceless figures standing in perfect stillness, watching her with their hollow, unseeing eyes. They were waiting, patient and unyielding, as if they had all the time in the universe to claim her. But it was Sarah's transformation that struck terror into Emily's heart. Sarah, once so vibrant and inquisitive, had become a ghostly shell of herself. She wandered the lab in silence, her gaze vacant, her face slack and expressionless. Sometimes she would mutter under her breath, phrases that made no sense, fragments of languages that none of them recognized. At first, they had tried to shake her out of it, to bring her back to some semblance of herself, but now they hardly dared look at her. One night, Emily found her standing in front of the main screen, her hands pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared into the image of E59. The planet's dark, twisted landscapes reflected in her pupils, and she spoke in a low, guttural tone that sent shivers down Emily's spine. "They are here," Sarah whispered, her voice a dead echo. "They've been here all along, waiting for us to find them. And now that we have, they'll never let us go." Emily took a step back, her mind reeling. It was as if Sarah was no longer herself, as if EI-59 had burrowed its way inside her, twisting her thoughts, her very soul, until she was nothing more than a mouthpiece for whatever dark intelligence lingered there. She felt an overwhelming urge to run, to flee from the lab, from Sarah, from the monitors that pulsed with a sickly, unnatural light. But there was nowhere to go. The lab had become a prison, and every attempt to leave was thwarted by some unseen force, some silent, impenetrable barrier. Days slipped by, blending into one another, and the team's sanity unraveled with each passing moment. Emily would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, shadows that darted just beyond her vision, figures that seemed to watch her, only to vanish when she turned to look. She began to hear voices, faint whispers that drifted through the lab, speaking in tones that were both soothing and filled with malice. They called to her, beckoning her to listen, to surrender. "You're slipping, Emily," Alex said one day, his voice hollow. His eyes were dark, ringed with shadows, and his skin had taken on a pallid, almost waxen hue. "You hear it too, don't you? The hum, it's inside us now. It's in our heads, crawling through our minds, changing us." She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, but the words caught in her throat, because she did hear it. The hum had become a constant presence, a low rhythmic pulse that resonated in her skull, filling her thoughts, her dreams. It was the sound of E59's heartbeat, steady and insistent, echoing across the infinite void. And with every beat, it grew louder, more invasive, burrowing deeper into her consciousness. One night, she awoke to find Sarah standing over her, her face expressionless, her eyes wide and glassy. She stared down at Emily, her lips parting as she spoke in a voice that was not her own, a voice that was deep and ancient, filled with a malice that chilled Emily to her core. "It's beautiful, Emily," Sarah whispered, her tone filled with a strange, reverent awe. "E59 has shown me things, secrets buried in the darkness of the universe. We were never meant to know them, but now we're part of them. We belong to it." Emily recoiled, scrambling out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel it now, an alien presence seeping into her thoughts, pressing against her mind with a weight that was unbearable. She clutched her head, trying to block it out, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her ears with words she couldn't understand, words that held a promise of suffering, of despair. Days later, Alex was found in the lab, his face contorted in horror, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Emily approached him, dreading what she would find, and as she leaned closer, she realized his mouth was moving, mouthing silent words. "They've taken him," Sarah whispered from behind her, her voice cold and detached. "He saw too much. He tried to resist, and now he's theirs." Emily looked at Sarah, a growing horror taking root in her chest. It was as though the Sarah she had known was gone, replaced by something else, something empty and hollow, like the shadowed figures on E59. She felt a chill creep down her spine as she realized she was losing herself too, piece by piece. E59 was consuming them, pulling them into its darkness, twisting them into something less than human. In the dim light of the lab, she saw her reflection on the monitor, and for an instant she saw another face looking back at her. Pale, expressionless, its eyes wide and hollow, staring at her with an intensity that left her breathless. It was her own face, but warped, drained of life, as though the person she once was had slipped away, leaving only a hollow shell. She reached out, touching the screen, and felt a pulse beneath her fingers, a heartbeat that was not her own. And in that moment, she understood the terrible truth. They were no longer just observing E59. They were becoming part of it, their minds unraveling, their identities fading, until they would be nothing more than shadows in its endless twisted landscape. They were becoming like the figures in their dreams, empty, hollow, forever watching, forever waiting. The hum rose, louder and louder, filling her thoughts, her body, her very soul, and she could no longer tell where she ended and E59 began. Emily could barely remember what life had been like before E59. She sat in the dimly lit lab, staring at the monitor, her vision blurred from exhaustion. Somewhere in the building, the hollow hum continued, pulsing through the walls, through the floors, through her own skull. The screens flickered, displaying fragmented images from E59 that felt like shards of a terrible dream, a nightmare from which she could no longer wake. Alex was gone. At least, what had been Alex? His workstation lay empty, a cold reminder that he, like Sarah, had succumbed to whatever alien force had seized their minds. Sarah was still here in body, though her eyes had long since turned vacant, her expression frozen in a state of eerie serenity. She no longer spoke to Emily, no longer seemed to recognize her. Instead, she spent her days pacing the lab in slow, rhythmic patterns, her eyes locked on to something far away, something only she could see. Emily clung to what little sanity she had left, fighting the whispers that clawed at the edges of her mind, the strange thoughts that weren't her own. She could feel E59 inside her now, like a cancerous growth, weaving itself through her memories, her identity, her very soul. She hadn't slept in days. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back there, standing in one of the twisted cities under E59's blood-red sky, surrounded by the empty, watchful figures that mirrored her every movement. And now, a horrifying realization had taken root in her mind, an understanding so vast and incomprehensible that she struggled to hold on to it without losing herself completely. She knew what E59 was, what it wanted, and why it had reached out to them across the void. She stood, her legs trembling, and approached the console, her fingers brushing over the keys. She had to record this revelation before her mind slipped away, before she became like Alex, like Sarah, a hollow vessel for something beyond her comprehension. With a shaky breath, she began to type, her fingers moving almost mechanically, as though guided by something other than her own will. A 59 was once like us, a world of people, of life. But it was consumed by something, a presence, a vast intelligence beyond our understanding, an ancient awareness that turned its inhabitants into extensions of itself. It took everything from them, their thoughts, their identities, their very humanity, and transformed them into shadows, remnants, vessels of its will. It is not just a planet, it is a mind that has existed for eons, watching, waiting for a way to reach across the cosmos, to consume, to assimilate. Emily paused, feeling her pulse quicken. She could sense it now, a flickering presence in the back of her mind, like a second consciousness pressing against her own, whispering dark truths in a language she couldn't fully understand. She was connected to it, to E59, to the collective mind that had devoured an entire world, and it was growing stronger. It found us through our technology, through the scanner that was supposed to be a tool for discovery. We were so eager to explore, to seek out the unknown, to prove that we were not alone. But a 59 is not a world to be discovered. It is a trap, a web woven across the stars, waiting for minds like ours to reach too far, to stare too deeply into the abyss. A soft, rhythmic tapping interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Sarah standing by the console, her expression unreadable, her fingers moving in a strange, ritualistic pattern against the metal surface. Her eyes met Emily's, and for a brief moment a spark of recognition flashed within them. Something human, something familiar. But it faded as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold, vacant stare that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "They are waiting, Emily," Sarah murmured, her voice soft, almost reverent. "They've always been waiting. And now, they found us." Emily felt a wave of nausea roll over her as Sarah's words sank in, as the full weight of her revelation settled in her mind. This was what E59 wanted, to extend itself, to spread its consciousness beyond its own twisted world, to absorb new minds, new worlds. By observing it, by reaching out to it, they had opened a door, an irreversible passage between their world and this ancient, consuming intelligence. Her hands shook as she typed her final words, a desperate attempt to warn anyone who might come across their research, anyone who might think to seek out E59. Do not look for it. Do not search for E59. It will call to you, lure you with visions of discovery, but it is a trap. It will take everything from you, your mind, your memories, your identity, and you will become part of it, a shadow in its endless twisted cities, a vessel of its will. This knowledge is a curse, a price we were never meant to pay. The hum grew louder, deeper, as if responding to her words, pulsing with a strange, mocking rhythm that filled the room. She felt it pressing against her thoughts, a suffocating weight that wrapped around her mind like a shroud. Her vision blurred, and she could no longer tell where she was, whether she stood in the lab or in the shadowed streets of E59, surrounded by the empty, watchful figures that mirrored her every movement. Sarah's voice broke through the haze, soft and distant, as though echoing from some far-off place. "It's time, Emily. They're calling for us. We are theirs now." Emily wanted to resist, to fight, but the weight was too much, too heavy. She could feel herself slipping, her thoughts fading, merging with something vast and dark, a consciousness that stretched across the stars, ancient and endless. She understood now that this was the price of knowledge, the price of reaching too far, of seeking truths that were never meant to be found. In her final moments of lucidity, Emily looked down at her hands, watching as they trembled, her fingers blurring, fading, becoming transparent as though her very body was dissolving, being pulled into the cold, unfeeling depths of E59. She was no longer herself, no longer Emily Carter, scientist, explorer. She was part of something larger, something monstrous, an endless, consuming darkness that stretched across the cosmos. And as she slipped into the silence, her last thought was a whisper, a warning to anyone who might find her notes, who might be tempted to look too deeply into the unknown. Don't look for it. Don't look for E59. The room fell silent, the hum fading into a quiet that was deeper than death. The monitors flickered one last time, displaying the twisted landscapes of E59, the shadowed figures standing in perfect stillness, waiting, watching, ready for the next mind that would seek them out, for the next soul to reach across the stars in search of discovery. They would wait. They had all the time in the universe.